Okay, so we are going to come on to back up to the top of the eye here. We're going to start with a little bit of the darkest sepia from the illuminants, and I'm just going to gently just start blocking in a little bit more of that darker colour. Again, never pressing much harder than sort of our initial layers, but just working in a very, very slow and controlled movement to make sure we are getting the tooth, like every little part of the tooth of the paper. And obviously using a slightly lighter pressure again as we come away and into that cooler part where we can see that blue toned area. And then as we start working down into the slightly lighter areas, I'm just going to swap and use a little bit of the sepia 50%. And using this towards that cooler area as well. So it should create almost like a bit of a purpley cool blend. Then back in with the cold grey 6 and starting to really try and pull in some of those darker details. So we still want there to be that light, little bit of that lighter colour showing through, Payne's grey, but we definitely want there to be some of these darker parts as well. So just mixing between the sepia 50%, light pressure, and the cold grey 6. You could even use a little bit of the cold grey 4 just over the top through these lighter areas, or even some of the cold grey 1 from the polychromos. Again, just using it to gently smooth over the top. Just glazing just to remove a little bit of that grain so it all becomes very, very smooth. If you really want there to be a little bit more of that cooler blue tone, I'm just going to glaze with the Payne's Grey 30%. Pushing into that sepia a little bit, creating that smooth blend. And again, a little bit more of the sepia before going over the top with the cold grey 1. And again, you'll notice that I'm only working in the direction of the fur and just putting in a little bit of a darker colour, then glazing over with a bit of the Payne's Grey and Cold Grey one, just to smooth it all down again. And then using some more of the Cold Grey 6 to build a little bit. So you'd like to use a polychromos to build up the details a little bit more, so you can kind of create a bit more a finer point with these pencils. And as we start to build in towards the more yellowy toned area, I think I'm just going to use a little bit of the Vista. And again, just following the direction of the fur. Now I'm going to be blending this with some of the purpley shades to really create that smooth transition. So putting a little bit of Vista, then going over with some of the sepia 10%. So again, a little bit of the sepia over the top of the Vista. Trying to create a little bit of that smooth sort of like blend. Starting off with a light layer, and then just beginning to sort of pull in more depth to that colour as we move forwards. And then again, I think it's really a good idea to start putting in a little bit more of the darker colours where we can see them. So I'm just using a little bit of the dark sepia just to start blocking in some of these darker shade through here, and it's going to allow us to work out just how dark we need to make those yellowy areas. Again, focusing on the shapes, because these darker areas, there's not an awful lot of detail in them. And then again, just as we start to build out and sort of blend in towards those lighter areas, just gonna loosely take a little bit of the sepia. This is just the sepia 50%. And again, just lightly sort of blending it. Building up a little bit more of the colour. And just taking a little bit of the cold grey 4 and just blending again in towards our sepia. So we're going to start to work on our transitional blends. And just taking a little bit more of the Vista, just really lightly. In fact, if that's looking a little bit too dark, then maybe just go in a little bit with the brown ochre 50% from the luminance, and we're just gonna look at just creating really light sort of. The thing is, I know this looks really dark, like fully aware that it looks super dark. However, when we start smoothing it down, because in order for us to get rid of some of this graininess that we can see, I do tend to like going in with a light colour over the top just to kind of smooth everything down. So despite the fact this, you might be thinking, okay, well that looks really dark, I'll show you what we can do in a minute to kind of just lighten everything up again. So again, just blending it all over, even taking a bit over here as well. Again, the more light layers we can get down, the better. Your base layers don't have to be perfect. And then we can just take a little bit of the sepia 10% and just sort of glaze that over as well, just to kind of create that a bit more of that blend. Another really great kind of transition colour you could use would be a bit of the Warm Earth by the Luminance, and this is the 40%. This is almost like it's a pinky beigey red, which is going to sit really nicely in between the purpley hue and the yellowy hue. So you can just add this in to help sort of create that deeper blend. And again, you'll notice that all I'm doing is just being quite messy with my pencil strokes at the moment. It doesn't have to be perfect. We can refine everything as we go. So I'm just going to use a little bit of this just to, again, as I said, just start to work a little bit on that transition. And I'm also just going to pop a little bit over on this side, just taking it above and over the sepia 10% to give it a little bit more of that pinky sort of brown hue. And now we're going to start on working a little bit more slowly and smoothly, with starting off with a bit of the sepia 10% and just beginning to sort of just I'm not pressing too hard, I'm just trying to work quite smoothly just to smooth out the surface a little bit. Just paying attention to any sort of darker areas, just lightly filling in the tooth a little bit more to add a little bit of depth. And then again, I think I'm just going to start to build a little bit more of the sepia 50% over the top. Starting to work a lot more slowly now. And sort of just pulling in a little bit of that sepia 50% into that yellow. Again, paying close attention to any darker areas. And drawing in the direction of the fur as always. And then we're just going to go over the top with some of the darkest sepia. Again, trying to let some of that yellow show through underneath. And then just bringing a little bit more of that vista in to darken, begin to darken the corner. Just mapping out where it's a lot darker. So those wrinkles. Again, just working very, very sort of gently, building up into those darker areas. And then over the top we could just take a bit of the burnt umber. And then we're just going to take the sepia, darkest sepia from the luminance. I'm giving it a really good sharpen, because one thing I always find is if you're not getting enough colour down, then give your pencil a sharpen. And I think it's because it's got a sharper point, it just seems to sort of go into the teeth of the paper a little bit better. So that's before you sort of start thinking you need to go up into a darker colour, just always give your pencil a little sharpen first and see whether that makes a difference. And just flipping between the burnt umber and beginning to sort of work on really putting down some pigment now, to really start to sort of build up the contrast a little bit more. If you feel like your lighter areas need a little bit more colour, then just take some of the brown ochre, 50%, just running that over, and then again maybe a little bit Vista. And then again some of the burnt umber. And then again, as I keep saying, we're just building up with the darkest sepia, and you'll notice that I'm never drawing sort of a line like that. I'm always going backwards and forwards to create a really sort of nice even. Then we're just going to take a little bit more with the Bista and start to bring it in towards that lighter area, so just using very light pressure. Again, always following the direction of the fur. And then again, just building up, so going in over the top lightly with some of the burnt umber. And then again, some more Bista through those lighter areas, and you could even use maybe a little bit of the cinnamon as well from the Pablos, just gently to bring in a bit more of that brighter sort of yellowy orangey. Just smoothly glazing that over, and then just taking some of the darkest sepia again, trying not to take it too low because we don't want to make it too dark. Sort of too dark, too low even, and then just blending and putting in some more of the raw umber. So this bit through here seems to be a little bit darker, so I think I'm just going to go straight in with some of the burnt umber, again following the direction of the fur or the detail. Trying to use a heavier pressure to kind of blend out these harsher lines, and then over the top we're just going to take some of the darkest sepia and just sort of blending them out that way as well. blending again, going backwards and forwards between the burnt umber and the dark sepia. And the darkest sepia from the luminous, not the dark sepia, because that's not the correct pencil. Well, ultimately you can kind of use anything that you prefer, but I'm also just going to use some of the sepia 50% as I start to build a little bit more of the contrast and detail into the sort of cooler tone here, and just using a little bit just to sort of start pushing gently into. And then I'm also at this point going to probably use a bit of the warm grey 6, because it should just go over quite nicely to start building up a little bit of that sort of duller contrast. Starting to leave out obviously the lighter areas, but darkening up where required. Again, just following the detail and the direction of the fur. And just building up more of the burnt umber. Before going in again with some of the sepia, and again all I'm doing is just focusing on the direction of the fur and the shapes that I can see, trying to forget what I'm actually drawing, because I find that really does help in order to sort of establish the right amount of depth in the right areas, just focusing on the shapes that I can see. Again, just carrying on with the sepia just to build up. Obviously using a light pressure as we start to head in towards the sort of the highlighted area above here. Just following it down with the sepia over the top where we just put the warm grey. Just beginning to blend into those darker areas. Again, just starting to build up a little bit more with the warm grey. Again, don't want to make it too dark. Just using a light pressure just to block in some of the shapes. Using the burnt umber just to fade in a little bit of that brown tone, the yellowy brown. And then we're just going to take a little bit more of the warm grey 6, and again just building up some more of the contrast just by adding in some layers of this. And drawing in some of the shapes. Again, just following, as I keep saying, I feel like a broken record, but the details and the direction of the direction of the details. Then just take a little bit more bistar and just running that gently. And then over the top of all of that, I'm just going to start to use a little bit of black, starting to build it into these darker areas. So this is just the polychromos black. And again, just focusing on the shapes that we can see. Just building up the depth. You could also use a bit of dark sepia. This is the dark sepia from the polychromos, it's like a very deep browny kind of hue, but slightly sort of flatter than the sepia, than the luminance, sorry. Again, just working in the direction of the fur with the dark sepia. Aim is obviously to build as much contrast as we possibly can. You know, if you want to include a little bit more of like an orangey kind of feel, then, or just smooth out that dark sepia, you can just use a bit of the darkest burnt ochre. And just placing this gently over the top to glaze it in and sort of just bring in a little bit more of a richer colour. Just keep building up our layers with the darker sepia from the luminance. Again, making sure that we can still leave some of that sort of yellowy hue showing through. We're just using this to darken and really work on that contrast, because, so I always say, the thing to make that makes any sort of piece of artwork look the most realistic is by really having very, very deep contrasts. So making sure our lights are light and our darks are as dark as they need to be. Just taking a little bit more of the black from the polychromos and just beginning to sort of fade out from that darker area here, fade it in towards that lighter bit. And then, yeah, taking the black and just building up away from the darker parts. Just using a light pressure. And then using the sepia from the luminance again as we start to work in towards that yellowy bit. Okay, so now we want to work on this sort of section down here to blend out this area into the cooler tone and actually add a little bit more depth through here. So I'm going to start off by taking a little bit of the cold grey 6 and I'm just going to gently just work in sort of smooth downward strokes just to, again, just get rid of any texture in the paper and just create a little bit more depth. Just paying close attention as always to the details we can see in the reference photo. I think optimistically, I thought this tutorial could be one sort of smooth, just one video, but I think because this seems to be taking me quite a long time to do this, so it might be over a couple of videos, which is absolutely fine. So I don't know what part this is going to be, but it's been quite a hectic week, so I haven't had an awful lot of time to sort of sit down and work on this. I'm just taking a little bit of the dark sepia from the polychromos here, and I'm just adding that just to start to help blend out from this sort of sepia tone here. Now you might sort of see it as a little bit more cooler, you might be thinking, okay, we need to add a little bit more blue, but in all honesty, I think in the overall effect, like, it doesn't really make an awful lot of difference, especially to these darker areas. So I'm going to put that in, and I'm also just going to take a little bit of black over the top, which is sort of just going to combine all those under colours together a little bit more. And we're just going to take a little bit more of the cold grey 6, and I'm just going to start to go over where we just put that dark sepia. So you'll notice that with one pencil stroke I'm sort of working this way, and with another colour I'm working the other way, and that's just to create a bit of more of a smoother finish. Just using even pressure, just gently trying to darken up the paper a little bit. And then again, just taking some of the black, and we're just going to start to bring in a little bit more of the detail with the black. So any sort of lines we can see. And you might even want to add maybe a little bit more of the Payne's Grey 30% just over those lighter areas. And again, it's just these little sort of hidden colours which you can just take over the top, and it just helps smooth and create almost like that glassy sort of smoothness to the skin. Just continue with the Payne's Grey 30% and just sort of glazing it over. Then again, into this corner, we're just going to, where it's a lot lighter, another little layer of the silver grey. And then once that's nice and smooth, you should be able to now just use the Cold Grey 6 to start creating a little bit more of the detail. You could just go over again with a little bit of black, gently. Just, I don't want to press too hard. I'm just trying to sort of create a little bit of a blend between this darker area and the lighter one. And just using a little bit more of the Cold Grey 6 and sort of just go backwards and forwards and just layering up, sort of creating little elements of detail. And again, little bits of black. Just if you want to add obviously any more of that cooler tone in down here, just going to smooth it down with a bit of the Cold Grey 4. And adding a little bit of black here and there just to add again more detail and depth. If it's too dark, then just go back in with some of the cold grey 6. Or just to demonstrate, you could use some of the warm grey 6 as well, just in case you're not getting enough pigment down with the cold grey. I tend to like using a little bit of the both combined. So using the cold grey in the areas I know I just want a little bit cooler. And you could also just use with the down drawing black just gently into the real centre part of this dark area here. Just adding a little bit more of the black. Also, where we've just put a little bit of the drawing black, you could use some of the dark indigo, again very, very gently and sparingly, because like with all these colours, it's super, super pigmented. And I just glaze it over the edge of where we put that sepia. Now this, you might be thinking, okay, that's very, very cool and blue toned, but it really, in the grand scheme of things, when you sort of pull out from the piece, it really, really does make a bit of a difference. So I really like doing things like this, just to give the drawing a little bit more depth, especially over some of those sort of purpley dark sepia areas. Then just coming down below here, you can see there's a little bit of like that cooler grey tone still, so I'm going to take a little bit of the cold grey 4, just gently beginning to just build light pressure down . And then this is where we might start using a little bit of the brownish beige as well. Just to start incorporating a bit more of that sort of neutral purpley brown tone. So I'm working in the direction of the fur, trying to leave a little bit of that yellow showing through. And then we're just going to use some of the Payne's Grey 30% just below this area here. And it's a little bit lighter in some parts as well, so maybe just a bit of the silver grey. Again, I really, as I keep saying, like to use the luminance a lot for base layers and for sort of like going over darker areas as well, just to smooth them down a little bit more and create a little bit more of the lightness. Okay, so just underneath this area, it obviously goes from this dark to a yellowy orangey pinky hue and then goes into the purple. But to create this transition, we can't just go from this to the like yellow, that won't look right. So we need to create that smooth light transition. So I'm going to focus on the darker colours that I can see underneath, and I'm kind of just looking for the lightest areas within those darker colours, so if that makes any sense at all. So what I'm going to do is just take a little bit of the cold grey. This is just the cold grey 1 from the Polychromos, and I'm just going to glaze that down. So I'm just using a very, very light pressure and light layer to create just a little element of colour on the paper. I'm not going to take it too far over this side because it does get a little bit more on the yellowy orangey side, so I'm just going to focus that through this bit. You could also use, if you want a slightly more neutral grey, I really like to blend a little bit warm grey 1 over the top of the cold grey. It just neutralises the grey a tiny bit, so you could do that, but that's completely optional. Over on this side, obviously, we've got almost like a little bit of an orangey purpley hue. So I'm just looking at taking a light, very light pressure first of the brown ochre. This is just the brown ochre 10%. And what you could do as well is just take the warm grey 1 again and just layer it over the top to kind of just create a little bit more of that smoother transition. It's not going to be too smooth just yet, but in time obviously we'll get there. Up this side where it's a little bit darker, I'm just going to focus on putting in a little bit more of the brown ochre 10%. Removing the graphite through these light areas, really, really important. Then just going over again with a bit more of the brown ochre, 10%. Now, an amazing light yellowy creamy colour is the buff titanium from the Luminance, so I'm just going to blend that over the top, and that's going to help us combine between the brown ochre and the greys that we just put down. Then I'm just going to take this over here a little bit more, then focusing again on bringing in a bit of the brown ochre. Again, just removing the bits of graphite. I'm going to blend a little bit of the burnt ochre 10% in, and this is a much more of an orangey reddy kind of hue, which is going to just allow us to sort of blend in really nicely with the yellow, but also going to help us establish a little bit more of the browny kind of purpley hue that we've got going into this section down here. So again, as always, very, very light pressures. And as we start to come down a little bit more, I'm just going to use a very light pressure of the brown ochre 10%. And you see this area through here is a lot lighter, so I'm just gonna, again, just glaze over the top with a bit of the buff titanium. Again, just removing the graphite lines. And on this side, I'm actually just going to use a little bit of the burnt ochre because I want there to be a slightly more orangey hue. So a little bit of the brown ochre as my sort of like initial base layer. And then using again a little bit more of the brown ochre, 10%, just glazing it over, again very, very smoothly. Take it in towards the brown ochre, burnt ochre as well. And then we've got a lot of lightness down here, and it gets a little bit darker at the bottom here. So for the darker areas at the bottom, of course, we're just going to be removing the line art. And then we are going to go over with a little bit of the sepia, 10%. We got a lot of lightness through here, and it's quite a cool lightness as well. So I'm just going to use a little bit of the silver grey, just layering that down. And you could even take it over the buff titanium as well. I really like to sort of incorporate a little bit more of a blue cooler tone over my sort of, you can see there's a little bit of a blue tone, so I might as well just pop it in with our base layers. And then through here we can kind of see it goes a little bit warmer as we move in towards the yellow. So I am going to use maybe a little bit of the warm grey one. Again, this can be, you know, this, you don't have to be completely accurate, because where we're using such a light pressure, we are able to tone and build and sort of control our layers and control the contrast and how we are building depth in the colour range as well. So like through here I can see that I want there to be a little bit more of an orangey hue, so I'm just going to gently glaze a little bit of the burnt ochre over the top. Just gently, don't want it to go too sort of like too much, so just putting a little bit in. And then you could glaze a little bit more of the sepia, 10% over the top as well. Okay, so now we've got most of our base layer in, I'm going to start looking at the mid-tones. See over here, as we started off up here, we've got almost like a little bit of a browny reddy hue. So I'm going to use a little bit of the warm earth, 40% from the luminance, and just start to gently, again, using not as light a pressure as the base layer, but just very light pressure, but slightly more controlled movement with our pencil. You can just work in sort of like different directions with this as well, because it is out of focus. We can just gently build up our layers, and they don't have to at this point be working in the direction of the fur really. We just want there to be enough pigment on the paper to give it that saturation of colour. So again, down here we can see it gets a lot darker. So in order for us to establish how light we will need our light areas, I'm just going to pop in a little bit of the sepia 50%, and just beginning to just layer this down. And as we start to work in towards where we just put the warm earth, just use a little bit of the brownish beige. And maybe a little bit of the Van Dyke brown as well, just to start to bring in a little bit more of that depth, working in towards the warm earth. Just moving backwards and forwards between the warm earth and the brown. Again, just focusing on building up the level of saturation on the paper. Doesn't matter if it's looking a little bit too on the sort of orangey reddy side, because we can tweak and adjust. So again, just the Van Dyke brown. And once again, I know I'm just jumping through the colours here, but I'm just going to use a little bit of the darkest sepia from the luminance, and I'm opting for the darkest sepia from the luminance instead of from the polychromos, because this has got a slightly more brown purpley hue to it, so it should work quite nicely. I sometimes find the dark sepia from the polychromos a little bit flat. Again, just keep layering. Now obviously this bit is out of focus, so as much as we want the depth, we don't really want there to be the detail or the grain showing through. So I'm just going to layer this in gently first. And then we are just gonna take a little bit of the Van Dyke brown, just glazing it over. Again, we don't want to press too hard, just want there to be enough pigment down. And then just going back in with the sepia, the darker sepia. And just beginning to sort of push this a little bit harder into the paper. again, not pressing crazy hard. I'm just trying to just build up a little bit more of the depth of colour. And then you could just maybe go over again once more. In fact, do you know what, I might even use a little bit of the brownish beige from the Pablo's, and just running that over where we've just put that sepia, just to incorporate a little bit more of a light layer. And then as we sort of head it more in towards the cooler, lighter areas, I'm just going to start to transition that in with a little bit of a lighter colour. So I'm taking the sepia 50%. And then you can see at the bottom here, we've almost got like these cool like blue like hair strokes. So I'm just gonna start incorporating that in with a little bit of the cold grey. Now the hairs are really long, don't particularly want to draw them like that. I think I want to just keep with this sort of like shorter fur theme, but I am gonna just put in the correct colours. So I'm gonna just start to transition the sepias into the cooler blue tones. So you're just taking the cold grey 4 and just drawing roughly in the direction of the fur. And then I'm also going to just use some of the brownish beige as we start to work up into that lighter area and down from the brownish, the brown ochre 10%. So I'm still trying to keep a little bit of that cooler tone showing through because I don't want to make it too dark. Hence why I'm going just in with the brown ochre, sorry, the brownish beige, because it's just not too sort of like contrast, it's not too dark for this. And then I'm just going to layer in maybe a little bit more of the brown ochre 10% through here and just, I think, mix it. So just use a bit of that, and I'm just going to mix it a little bit with the burnt ochre 10% as well. Just continuing to build up a little bit more of the brown, the burnt ochre, going down where it gets a lot darker. And again, a little bit more of the brown ochre over the top of where we put the greys. This is going to start to slowly sort of blend in that base layer. And just keep using light layers of the burnt ochre and the brown ochre. And I'm just also going to take a little bit of the sepia 10%, just lightly roughly draw over. So I'm just going to move between using the brownish beige and the sepia 10% because, to be honest, we can sort of use either. There's not that much in between. Well, there's not that much difference, I don't think. They're quite similar. I think the brownish beige has got a slightly sort of more grey brown undertone, and the sepia's just got a little bit more of a purpley hue. But they basically work the same. So we're just going to draw in the direction of the fur over the top of the sort of yellowy areas. I'm just focusing more on adding a little bit of depth into those darker parts. So just sticking with the brownish beige. And maybe adding a little bit of the cold grey 6 to start blending down from this sort of line, this darker area. Now I want to add a little bit more of a deeper reddy kind of hue, and I think there are so many open options that you can use with colour pencil. I think that's the thing that I'm trying to demonstrate during this class. There's no rhyme or reason to sort of pick. There's no specific colour choice to use. It's just whatever you can see. So I'm using the Warm Earth 40%, but you could easily use something a little bit more yellowy. You could use something a little bit more brown. Again, it's just very, very flexible because we're using only light pressure at any one time. It doesn't really matter. It's that this is sort of like quite a fail-safe way of working with the medium that can sort of allow us to make mistakes if we need to. Well, if we end up making mistakes, I should say. Or, adjusting bits that we're not necessarily so happy with. Also, you could just use a little bit of the nugget as well, just to add in a little bit more of that brown kind of hue. Again, very light pressure, just to build up. I'm just paying close attention to where any areas are a little bit darker and just sort of blocking them in as well. Just using a slightly more concentrated pencil stroke. I'm just going back in with some of the brownish beige into those lighter areas. And of course, always just working in the direction of the fur. And just taking even like a little bit of Van Dyke brown as well, just gently to bring in that sort of a little bit more of a brown hue. Into those darker areas. Now again, I feel awful when I say you can begin to understand the way the colours work together. It just takes time and practice. Like, I know that by adding a little bit of Van Dyke brown, I can easily just take a little bit of the sepia, 50%, and blend it in, and it's going to create that seamless blend. But this is just through trial and error and experience. And again, I also feel terrible, like saying, oh, all you need to do is practice. But that's how you learn about base layers and how colours work together, etc, etc. It's a lot of the time it just comes down to just giving the medium, your time and energy. And in time, obviously, you start to work out techniques that suit you and your style and everything like that. So again, just using more of the Van Dyke brown. So again, just starting to build up a little bit more in towards these sort of lower areas with the sepia at 50%. And then because I can see there's a little bit more of a cooler tone, so I'm just going to glaze in a bit of the cold grey 4. Again, just keep layering more of the warm earth in to kind of create more of that reddy brown. And then I'm just going to come up here and add a little bit of the nugget just to start to build a little bit of that transition between the eye and the skin around it. Sort of figuring out how much pressure to use to add a little bit of depth. Trying to really make this colour nice and rich. We just don't want to press too hard and make it too dark. Blending it in towards where we've put the brownish beige and the warm earth. So hopefully we'll kind of create that transition. Carry that colour through. And then over the nugget, if we've got an area that's a little bit of that darker browny yellow, I'm just going to use some of the burnt umber. Again, just very light pressure to sort of just blend this out a little bit. Again, just using a very light pressure to build this up. So you don't want to make this sort of a yellowy area too dark. And we're just going to use the Van Dyke Brown and just deepen any sort of like those darker markings that we can see. As we head up in towards those darker bits. Then we've got this little line through here, which obviously we don't want there to be that little line. So I'm just going to take the sepia 50%, just blend over the top. That, and using a little bit of the warm earth, 70% as well. Sorry, 40% warm earth. Just almost like creating that smooth transition. Again, just glazing over the top to really just saturate the colour in, but also create sort of like that outer focus. Glaze. So we're just trying to remove the grain. I'm just not pressing too hard and trying to keep everything quite light looking. We just need to add a little bit more depth through here to create that sort of smoother transition. And again, I think I can use a bit of the darkest sepia. from the Caran d'Ache. Again, just bringing it down and sort of blending. There's different things that we can do to really blend in this area here. I'm just going to take a little bit more of the darker sepia and just use the light pressure to start blending out into and then taking a little bit more of the cold grey 6 and just running that over as well, because using a little bit of that cooler blue tone over some orangey yellowy bits just again really helps elevate that contrast. And then we can just take a little bit of black and just kind of create those little deep hair strokes. And just blending out with a bit more of the darker sepia. Okay, so now we are just going to go over some of these areas here with a bit more of the sepia 50%. Just slowly and gently building up towards these darker areas. And I'm also just going to blend a little bit of the Van Dyke Brown in as well. Again, I don't want to make this too dark. I still want some of that light fur to be showing through, or that lighter colour to be showing through underneath. So I'm just not pressing too hard with these layers, and I'm not sort of putting my pencil strokes too close together. I want there to be a little bit of a gap that you can see underneath. And then we're just going to start going over a little bit of these darker areas with the sepia, the darkest sepia that is, from the luminance. Again, just focusing on the direction of the fur. And then again, when we want a little bit more of a brown hue, we're just going to use the Van Dyke Brown. Just consistently focusing on the direction of the fur, and also not taking it too far up here, because again, we've got a lot of detail to add through here, but I'm just focusing it on the darker areas that I can see through this bit. And again, just blending more and building up more of the sepia, darker sepia. Layering over. Again, always trying to keep a little bit of that underpainting or the underdrawing showing through the undercolours. And just blending again a little bit more of the cold grey 6 over some of these bits, just to again give it that cooler finish, just incorporating a little bit of that cool blue tone. Again, just building up. And then just going back in with the sepia, the darker sepia, into these slightly darker areas once again. And again, just blending between adding in more of the cold grey 6. So just adding a little bit of the cold grey 6 just up where we can see there's a light sort of area of that cooler tone again. And then again the Van Dyke Brown. and some of the sepia 50%. Just gently, because again we don't want to create too much sort of darkness through these lighter areas. We want to keep them looking really, really light. So we can incorporate a little bit more contrast into the darker areas by making them obviously a lot darker, which in turn will help us achieve a lot more of a lighter looking area through here. Again, just building more of the sepia 50%. And I think I'm also just going to use some of the dark sepia from the polychromos just down here, because again, sometimes, especially if you've got a bit more of a cooler tone, we want it to be dark, but we don't necessarily want there to be that brown. So I feel like taking a little bit of the dark sepia will just neutralise it a little bit, but still make it dark. So again, always trying to focus on adding detail and contrast in these final layers. We're almost there, guys. If you're still with me, then well done, because I feel like this has been quite a long one. And then we're just going to use a little bit more of the cold grey 6 and just beginning to push that into the sepia and up into these cooler areas. Pressing a little bit harder to create more of a sort of flatter pencil stroke, and this should just allow it to look a little bit more textured, like a bit more of that softer fur look. And again, another little bit of the Van Dyke brown, and starting once again to just layer up. And then again, we're just going to take some more of the dark sepia. Just go over some of those darkest areas. So really trying to work on building up this contrast. Again, more with a Van Dyke Brown, and we're just going to continue with the same pencils that we've been using, just layering up and sort of darkening any areas that just need to be obviously made a little bit darker. And sometimes we can just glaze over, just toning the paper. We don't need there to be every single bit of detail. And then we're just going to keep layering. And with the sepia 50, just to kind of create those slightly out of focus areas. So again, you can just lightly glaze over with this just to smooth down the tooth a little bit more. In any areas that have got that sort of more purpley hue. You could also maybe use a little bit of the sepia 10% in towards those lighter areas as well. And also in towards the darker bits. Sometimes just, as I keep saying, like glazing over with the luminance just really helps create that smooth sort of out of focus look. So even taking some of the silver grey and just heading over those cooler areas, again very lightly. So again, as we start to build up in towards that lighter area, I'm just going to continue just to build a little bit more of the warm earth, 40% over this side. Just lightly sort of blending it down and in. And then we are going to use think just a little bit of the brownish beige. Just blending again a little bit of the Van Dyke brown gently. Again, we don't want to make this too sort of dark. It's a very light area, but even if we do, it's not the end of the world because we can use a slice tool. But we kind of just want to keep everything very, very soft looking. So you could just take a little bit of the buff titanium even, put in more layers of that down, and then I think I'm going to also use just a tiny bit of nugget to give it a little bit more of that yellowy vibe. Like that browny yellow. Just using it to sort of blend out from the Van Dyke brown a little bit more. And then again, just blending more of the brownish beige. Following the direction of the fur. And then we just need to darken everything up. So I think you could use just a little bit of the sepia 50. Again, just taking a little bit of the nugget just to kind of blend in a little bit more of that yellowy hue. And some of the Van Dyke brown. Gently build out that brown. And then we're just going to take a little bit more of the Coal Grey 6, just again blending gently down. Again, always ensure I'm trying to keep a little bit of that lighter area showing through. And even adding a little bit more of the burnt umber over this side, just to again help that sort of transition. It's a little bit darker on that side. And you could just take a little bit of the warm grey 6 over the top of that, just to help blend it out from the black, from the darker area out. And then one of the last things we're going to do is we just need to smooth out this line. So I'm going to take some of the black polychromos. So make sure it's relatively nice and sharp, and then we're just going to just almost fade out. So starting with a more intense pressure towards the real dark areas and just lightening up our pressure as we come away, which should create quite a nice sort of subtle fade. You can definitely go over any darker areas with a bit of black as well. And again, just keep layering up. So again, just going to take a little bit more of the sepia, darker sepia, just blending this over and in towards some of these darkest shapes that we can see. And then we are just going to take the black from the polychromos and just start to finalize some of those details in the darker areas a little bit more. If you can hear a little wriggly worm, that's Charlie, my little cocker spaniel behind me. He likes to roll around on the carpet. And obviously if you're really looking to hype up your contrast, then any areas that have got a real load of darkness, then just go in lightly with the Derwent Drawing Black. Just start playing around with these contrast levels. Again, just using the lightest of light pressures. Just bring in a little bit more of the depth. Okay, so nearly there, guys. Just the final bits. So if you're wanting to put any sort of really light areas in, pencil that I would recommend would be the Museum Aquarelle White. This is a super pigmented white, which works really well. So I really like to just go over and really redefine some of those light areas, just to again establish just a little bit of the sort of different values, making sure that our light areas are super light. And this also just helps smooth down, and it sort of works over the top of some of those darker areas as well. Really trying to make the inner corner here nice and smooth. And then again, just keep going backwards and forwards between sort of like adding in little elements of like the darkest darks with the derwent drawing, ivory black and the white. You can really spend a little bit of time redefining any areas that just need a little bit more. And of course, just going over and really redefining any areas. But aside from that, I think I'm ready to call this done, I think. Of course, you could use the slice tool to go over and sort of like sharpen up or bring in any sort of little fur elements or additional fur elements. That works really well and really nicely, just using a very light pressure. And you can really sort of like establish and get some of those light fur strokes in there as well. So if you would like, let me just demonstrate that for you quickly. So again, you can just sort of lift like a few of these sort of light areas off, and it does work really well, but of course just use a very light pressure, and we don't want to create sort of any lines that are too harsh, so we're just trying to keep everything very sort of on the neutral, and just lifting off little elements here and there. Of course, always following the direction of the fur. I'm going to focus this in the areas where there is detail, because over here, you know, or over this side, it's a little bit more on the out of focus parts. So again, we don't really want to be adding too much detail to those bits. So just focusing on this side here. And I think after all that demonstration, I think I am ready to call this piece done. I will probably still end up going over this for about for a little while, just tweaking and adjusting until I'm completely happy. But there's not an awful lot more I can demonstrate for this one, so I'm going to call it a day and say thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much for watching. I really, really hope you've enjoyed this. I really hope you've learned lots. If it's your first time doing or having anything to do with coloured pencil, then I really hope you have picked up a couple of useful tips and tricks and maybe gained a little bit of confidence along the way. If you are giving this one a go, then please tag me either on Facebook or Instagram, or there is a coloured pencil group which I will have linked below in the description box. So share any work or questions or anything at all in there. And yeah, thank you so much for being here. I really, really hope you've enjoyed, and hopefully I will see you very, very soon. Take care and lots of love. Bye.